Alexander Moore, a 30-year-old millionaire, lived surrounded by luxuries in his vast estate on the outskirts of town. However, despite having everything, he felt an emptiness in his heart that nothing seemed able to fill. He had inherited a fortune after his parents' tragic accident when he was still very young, and since then, money had become his only companion. Nights in the estate were silent, and although he had servants and every imaginable comfort, Alexander felt terribly lonely, as if something essential was missing from his life. One evening, while driving his sports car through the city center, his gaze landed on an elderly woman rummaging through the trash. She looked frail, and her eyes reflected a profound sorrow, as if she carried years of suffering with her. Alexander felt a pang in his chest, and without thinking much, he stopped the car. Approaching her, his voice came out gently, almost as a whisper, trying not to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I help you with anything?" The elderly woman looked up, surprised and wary. She had learned not to trust anyone because the streets had taught her to fend for herself. However, something in Alexander's eyes made her feel a certain safety, as if he was different from the people she had encountered during her months of hardship. With a trembling voice, she replied, "My name is Hope. I've been on the streets for months since I was evicted from my apartment. I have no one to turn to." Alexander, moved by the sadness in her voice, felt a sincere compassion he had rarely experienced in his life of ease. Without hesitation, he offered her a place to stay, a small space in his estate that he didn't use, until she could find something better. Hope was speechless. No one had shown her such generosity since she ended up on the street. With tears in her eyes, she accepted Alexander's offer and, with a lump in her throat, followed him to the car. In silence, they headed to the estate, and Alexander found himself glancing at Hope, struck by her serenity despite her hardships. Upon arrival, Alexander led her to the garage, which had been fitted with a comfortable bed, a small bathroom, and a makeshift kitchen. For anyone else, it might have been inadequate, but for Hope, used to the harshness of the streets, it was like a small paradise. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. Alexander smiled, trying to hide his own emotion. This woman, with her humble presence, seemed to fill the void he had carried inside for so long. Unknowingly, they had found in each other a light in the middle of their solitary lives, a beacon that, in the days to come, would transform their destinies irreversibly. As the days passed, Alexander and Hope developed a quiet, yet meaningful routine. Alexander began to enjoy the moments shared with Hope, her stories, and the small lessons that seemed to illuminate his life with a perspective he had never known. He offered her companionship, and she, in her silent gratitude, showed him what life was beyond money and material possessions. One afternoon, as they shared a cup of tea in the garden, Hope mentioned that her birthday was approaching. Alexander was surprised to realize that, despite the trust they shared, he still knew very little about her life before she found herself on the street. Curiosity awakened in him, and with kindness, he tried to learn more about her past. "Hope, I know you don't like to talk about what you went through before we met, but I'd like to know more about you, about who you were, about who you really are." Hope looked at him for a few moments, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and gratitude. With a trembling voice, she began to tell him fragments of her life, pieces of memories that seemed buried in her mind. She spoke of her youth, her dreams as an artist, the promise of a bright future that life, at some point, had taken from her. Alexander listened attentively, each word resonating in his heart as an echo of his own solitude. "My life hasn't been easy, Alexander," she murmured with a sad smile. "Sometimes I struggle to remember the last time I had a place I could call home." Alexander felt such intense compassion that he could barely contain it. He wondered how it was possible that someone like Hope, with such inner richness, had ended up alone and abandoned. The connection between them grew stronger, and in that moment, he made a silent decision. He would do everything to restore the dignity she had lost. As her birthday drew near, Alexander started planning something special. He wanted to give her a moment of joy, something that would remind her there were still reasons to celebrate. He spent days thinking of ways to surprise her, organizing every detail with care and affection. He decorated the garage with lights and balloons, prepared her favorite dishes, and with a particular effort, managed to track down some of Hope's old friends who had never forgotten her and were moved to hear she was still alive. The birthday arrived. Alexander woke Hope early and took her for a walk around the city to distract her. Meanwhile, friends and acquaintances gathered at the estate, waiting for their return to welcome her. On their arrival, Hope was speechless seeing the decorated garage and the people who had come to celebrate her. Tears began to stream down her face as she approached Alexander and hugged him tightly. "I never thought anyone would do something like this for me. I don't know how to thank you, Alexander." He smiled, gently patting her shoulder. "You taught me to see life differently, Hope. This is just a small gesture compared to everything you've given me." That night, surrounded by friends and Alexander's affection, Hope felt complete for the first time in a long time. After the touching birthday celebration, Alexander felt that his relationship with Hope had reached a depth he had never thought possible. That special bond reminded him of the warmth of a home, something he hadn't felt since the death of his parents. Grateful for each day spent with her, he decided to find a way to give her back a little of the happiness she gave him. One morning, while they were having breakfast in the garden, Hope was watching the flowers bloom under the first rays of sunlight. The golden light illuminated her face, and Alexander felt a profound calm seeing her so serene, as if she were at peace with the world despite her years of struggle. Then he dared to ask her, "Hope, you once told me you were an artist. Why did you stop painting?" Hope looked away as if she were trying to avoid memories that still caused her pain. After a long silence, she sighed and began to speak, her voice full of nostalgia and sadness. "Painting was everything to me, Alexander. It was my way of expressing dreams, of shaping in colors and forms the emotions I couldn't say in words. But life has cruel ways of taking from us what we love. I decided to leave it out of necessity because I had to survive. Sometimes I think it was my greatest sacrifice." Alexander listened to every word, feeling a deep sadness for her. It was painful to imagine how someone with such a creative soul had been forced to abandon her passion. That feeling of compassion and admiration led him to make a silent promise. He would help Hope rediscover her love for art. A few days later, Alexander surprised her with a special gift. He had set up a room in the estate as an improvised art studio, with easels, canvases, and a variety of brushes and colors he had chosen carefully. When he showed her the place, Hope's eyes filled with tears of emotion. "Alexander, I don't know what to say. It's been so long since I held a brush. I don't know if I'm still capable." Alexander gently took her hand and smiled, reassuring her. "You don't have to worry about that. What matters is that you try. This is your space to rediscover who you once were. No pressure, just to enjoy." Moved, Hope hugged him tightly. That gesture meant more than he could imagine. Hope began painting again in the days that followed. At first, her hands trembled as she held the brush, and her strokes were hesitant. But with each line and every stroke, she regained confidence in herself, as if she were awakening a dormant part of her soul. Alexander observed her in silence, amazed by the skill and depth she expressed in her work. The studio became filled with life with every new painting, and he felt his home brighten with both Hope's art and her presence. Over the weeks, the change in Hope was noticeable. The passion reignited in her paintings gave her a vitality Alexander had never seen before. Every day, he found her in the studio, immersed in colors and shapes that seemed to express the essence of her being. That space had become a sanctuary, an extension of her soul. For Alexander, watching her transform the canvases into works full of life and emotion was like witnessing a miracle. Yet, despite her newfound happiness, Alexander noticed a lingering sadness and hope. In moments when she thought she was alone, he would catch her gazing at her work with a hint of melancholy, as if each brushstroke reminded her of the losses and sacrifices that had led her here. It was as though, in every stroke, she was trying to reconcile with a past filled with wounds that had never fully healed. One day, as they shared a cup of tea in the garden, Alexander decided to address the question that had been haunting him. "Hope," he said gently, looking at her hands folded in her lap. I know you've endured a lot. I see it in your eyes, in every painting. There's something in you that still doesn't allow you to be fully at peace. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here to listen. Hope looked at him in silence, struggling to contain her emotions. For long moments, a heavy silence hung in the air, laden with meaning and years of guarded secrets. Finally, she took a deep breath and decided to speak. It's true, I have a past I'm not proud of, she murmured, her voice trembling. I've had to make hard choices and live through things I never imagined. Sometimes, painting helps me release those memories, but the pain remains. Alexander gently took her hand, conveying his support without needing words. That confession, though brief, revealed the enormous emotional weight she had carried alone for so many years. Strengthened by Alexander's presence, Hope began to share more of her life. She spoke of a time when she had known someone special, a love that had been her refuge amid hardships. But that love, like everything precious in her life, had been cruelly taken from her. Her voice broke as she recalled moments that had marked her forever. Alexander felt a sense of helplessness and anger at the injustices Hope had endured. I'm sorry, Alexander, said Hope through tears, gripping his hands tightly. I never wanted to burden you with my shadows, but I feel I can be honest with you. Alexander embraced her, feeling her tears wet his shoulder. He had never experienced such a strong connection, such deep empathy for another person. In that moment, he understood he was willing to do anything to bring peace and happiness back to Hope. In the following weeks, Hope began to open her heart, as if she were yearning to free herself from the ghosts that haunted her. One afternoon, while she painted in her studio, Alexander found her staring at an old portrait of a family she once had. The painting, barely sketched, showed a young woman, a smiling man, and a child in his arms. Hope held the brush with a trembling hand, her expression one of such profound sadness that Alexander felt his chest tighten as he watched her. He was John, my husband, she whispered, her voice breaking. And this, she indicated the child's face in the painting, was my son. Alexander was at a loss for words. Hope, who had always shown him strength, now seemed fragile, shattered before him. He moved closer and sat beside her. Not wanting to interrupt the moment, she had finally felt ready to share the pain that had consumed her for years. John was everything to me. He taught me what it meant to love unconditionally, despite everything. We were happy together, dreaming of a simple, full life, but it never came to be. Hope's voice trailed off, and tears streamed down her cheeks, each drop a reflection of a wound that had never healed. Alexander listened in silence, feeling an indescribable weight in his heart. He knew that, for Hope, speaking of that pain was like reopening a wound that had never stopped bleeding. One night, Hope continued, her gaze distant. John didn't come home. They told me he'd had an accident, that he was gone. I never got to hug him again, never got to say goodbye. And I was left alone, holding our son, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Alexander felt a lump in his throat, his own emotions tangled with Hope's suffering. He couldn't imagine how someone could endure such loss. And yet there she was before him, revealing the scars life had left on her. I had to make a decision I never thought possible. Hope went on, her voice breaking. I knew that if I wanted my son to be safe, I had to distance him from me. I left him in the care of a family who could protect him. Her eyes filled with tears. That was the last time I saw him. Her voice broke completely, and she began to sob, the heartbreaking cry of a mother who had lost what she loved most in the world. Alexander felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. He couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of that pain, the loneliness Hope had endured all those years, the unimaginable sacrifice of giving up her child to protect him. Without thinking, he held her tightly, wishing he could alleviate, even a little, the suffering of this woman who had endured more than any human should have to. In that moment, as he held her in his arms, Alexander realized Hope wasn't just a survivor, but a true heroine who had sacrificed everything for love. His admiration and affection for her were indescribable, and through tears he whispered in her ear, I promise you'll never be alone again, Hope. Never again. That night, after Hope's painful confession, Alexander couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images, with Hope's broken voice, her tears as she recalled the loss of her family and the sacrifice of giving up her child. A consuming sorrow enveloped him. He wanted to do something to give Hope the chance to heal, to close the wound that life hadn't allowed her to mend. The next morning, Alexander began searching. He used every resource available, contacted private investigators, and looked through old archives, all in search of a trace, however small, of that lost son. Days passed, weeks of intense searching, and with every moment of waiting, Alexander felt as if time stood still. Every lead that went cold was a blow, but he pressed on, driven by Hope's image, by the promise he had made not to leave her alone again. Finally, one night he received a call. One of the investigators had found a lead, a name, an address. Alexander ended the call and took a deep breath, aware of the enormity of what he was about to do. The next morning, he woke Hope, his eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Hope," he said gently, trying to contain the emotion swelling in his chest. "I think I found your son." She looked at him in confusion, as if her mind refused to accept his words. When the reality of what Alexander was saying sank in, a mixture of fear and hope flooded her. Years of fruitless searching, the agony of waiting. Now it all came down to this moment, to a possibility she barely dared to imagine. Is it possible?" she asked, her voice breaking, her eyes filling with tears. Alexander nodded, gently holding her trembling hands. "Yes, Hope, I believe it's possible." Without wasting time, Alexander and Hope embarked on a journey to the small town where, according to the information received, lived the son she had never stopped loving. During the journey, Hope remained silent, gazing out the window, her mind lost in memories and questions. Alexander felt every second like a weight on his heart, aware of the depth of the moment. Finally, they arrived at the address. It was a modest house, surrounded by a small garden. Hope stepped out of the car on shaky legs, and Alexander helped her, supporting her as if he were an extension of herself. Together, they approached the door, and Hope raised a trembling hand to knock. The sound of footsteps on the other side of the door made Hope's heart race. Every second felt eternal. Finally, the door opened, and there stood a grown man. He had John's eyes, the same features she remembered in her little boy. Seeing him, Hope felt her soul tear open, the years of pain and sacrifice erupting in tears that seemed never-ending. "Mom?" the man whispered, with a mix of astonishment and emotion, as if he recognized her instinctively, as if the invisible bond between mother and child had never been broken. Hope threw herself into his arms, both trembling as they reunited after so many years. They both cried, holding on tightly, as if trying to reclaim every lost second, every caress, and every word they had never been able to share. Alexander, standing nearby, couldn't hold back his own tears as he witnessed the miracle before him. The reunion of a mother with her lost son, the closing of a wound that had been the source of so much pain and suffering. Hope caressed the face of her rediscovered son, her eyes capturing every detail of the man she had loved her whole life without having him by her side. And in that moment, amid tears and smiles, she understood that, although the past couldn't be changed, she had finally found the peace she had longed for. When Richard arrived, Alexander looked at him with a mixture of disdain and resolve. Before him stood the man who had shattered his childhood and cast terror into his mother's life. Alexander felt a deep rage, but he held it back, determined to unmask him without resorting to violence. "You know it's over, Richard. You've run for too long, but your lies have nowhere left to hide," Alexander said, maintaining a forced calm. Richard sneered, though there was a hint of fear in his eyes. He knew his years of darkness were numbered, and seeing Alexander, the son of the woman he had robbed of everything, made him feel cornered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, boy. You think you can challenge me, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." Alexander heard the threat in his words, but did not back down. He knew this confrontation wasn't just for himself, but for Hope and his brother, for the right to live without the weight of a past that Richard had forced upon them. The conversation ended with a silent promise. Alexander wouldn't rest until Richard was brought to justice, freeing his family from the shadow he had cast over their lives. A few days later, Alexander and Hope finally saw the justice they had longed for arrive. Richard was arrested, and with him vanished the last fragment of the dark past that had tormented their family. For Alexander and Hope, this victory was more than the fall of a dangerous man. It was the freedom to live without fear, the beginning of a new life. With Richard out of their lives, Alexander's estate transformed into a home filled with light and love. Hope and her rediscovered son filled every corner with warmth, and Alexander felt that, at last, the emptiness he had carried his entire life was beginning to heal. Days passed with shared laughter, rediscovering Hope's passion for painting, and creating new memories together, like a true family. One evening, as they walked together in the garden, Alexander looked at his mother and brother and felt that this moment was what he had always been waiting for. Taking Hope's hands, he smiled with gratitude and said, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for fighting, for surviving, for teaching me what it truly means to love. You're the reason I've found a purpose, a reason to live beyond material things." Hope, with tears in her eyes, hugged him, feeling that the weight of all those years of pain was finally dissolving. She looked at Alexander and her son, and in silence, she gave thanks for this second chance, for having found the family she loved so dearly. That night, the estate was filled with laughter, with shared stories, and with the promise of a future without secrets or shadows. For the first time in many years, Alexander felt whole, surrounded by the unconditional love he had always dreamed of. He knew that every hardship, every sacrifice, had been worth it to reach that moment of pure happiness. Did this story of love, sacrifice, and second chances move you? Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you enjoyed it, give it a like and subscribe for more stories filled with emotion and twists in the lives of millionaires. Don't miss what's coming next.